Welcome back. My experience is the best way to begin this journey is to go back into history and see where Dr. Deming's system of profound knowledge fit into the overall development and scheme of quality and quality movements. In this module, what I want to do is I want to look at two things, excellence and complexity. The word excellence today is used instead of the word quality. Quality is called the Q word in many companies, and you're not allowed to even speak it. And we'll talk about that and why the confusion associated with the definition of the word quality in a future module. Complexity is one of those things that haunts all executives. The world is an incredibly complex place. And one of the things that executives yearn for is structure. That is, give me a way, give me a template, give me a framework that I can use to take and bust all of this complexity that's going on in the world and bust that back into my situation so that I can make the proper decisions and go forward. So people in general, executives specifically, yearn for some kind of structure. And so I want to go back in history and show you how these structures emerged and why they emerged. And then I want to end by showing you over the next several videos why Deming's system of profound knowledge is actually the best framework for using to guide your career and guide your organization into the future. Let's start with the crisis. Here's what happened. After World War II, the United States had a monopoly on manufacturing. The Germans were destroyed, the Japanese were destroyed, the French were destroyed, the British were destroyed. There was virtually no manufacturing left on the earth other than in the United States for all practical purposes, especially in the Western world. And so if somebody wanted a washing machine, they had to buy an American washing machine. During the 1950s, the United States accumulated a vast amount of wealth. So much wealth, in fact, that today we export billions of dollars in trade deficits every single month, and we borrow billions and trillions of dollars. And the reason that we can continue to do that and have a decent economy and a decent standard of living is because of the wealth that was accumulated during the 1950s. I can't even begin to tell you what that did to the United States. So in the 1950s, if you were an executive, what you were limited by was the quantity of material that you could produce. That is, how much money you made was strictly a function of how much you could make. So you could make junk, terrible products, and they would still sell. Why? Because there was no alternative. If I wanted a refrigerator, it had to be an American refrigerator. If it was a terrible refrigerator, it really didn't matter. If it rusted and the bottom of it fell apart, whatever, it didn't matter because I could still sell it. So ironically, what happened at the end of World War II, and we'll explain more about this later, is that the Japanese quality starts to go exponentially better because they sought to learn from Americans about how they were able to defeat them in World War II. And quality, statistical process control specifically, became a major explanation for why the Japanese had lost the war. In the United States, quality goes into the tank. So by the 1960s and 70s, the United States is just making junk. I mean, we're making Ford Pintos that explode when somebody hits the back of them. And so this becomes part of a crisis that develops along about the late 1970s and early 1980s. By the time of the Jimmy Carter administration, it looks hopeless. No one has any idea how to really fix this. And so some people say, look, we just can't let the economy and the United States go into the tank. Let's figure out what's wrong. And so there were several kind of watershed studies and events, books that kind of guided America through this turbulent time. One of them was In Search of Excellence by Tom Peters and Bob Waterman. It's still today considered to be a masterpiece, and it's still read by many college students, and professors encourage their students to read them. I don't have time, and it's not really necessary for our purposes here to go into detail on all 8 of them, but let me just briefly tell you that all 8 of these things are exactly the opposite of what we were teaching in business schools during the 1980s. We were telling executives, we were training people to run organizations that had never been on an assembly line, never gone out and talked to customers. We taught people how to create complex organizations with these matrix structures where people had 3 or 4 bosses, these incredibly elaborate staffs, and all this, and the executives would sit in their offices at the top of some building, in Detroit, Michigan, surrounded by secretaries whose job it was to make sure that nobody got in to talk to them. The marketing people were the only people out talking to customers, and those people were shielded from talking their information getting back up to the executives, because nobody was allowed to give any bad information or any kind of negative information up to the executives. Executives were surrounded by a whole plethora of junior executives who wanted to become senior executives, and they viewed their job as keeping information from coming up the pike. If you go through these 8 things, you're going to see that these are exactly the opposite of what was being taught in business schools, and to a large extent, it still is what is being taught today. That is, that we don't teach our students how to work in organizations. As a matter of fact, most of the people that come out of MBA programs have never been in an assembly plant. They've never been on an assembly line. They wouldn't know how to design a product or put a product together than the man in the moon. And yet we send them out into the world to run organizations when they're completely incapable of it. And so Bob Waterman and Tom Peters are basically saying, if you want to have an excellent company, and here are a list of excellent companies, even in the middle of this crisis, who are doing well, internationally selling stuff and making profits and paying shareholders, and this is what they do. And what they do, of course, is just the opposite of what they're being taught to do. It's kind of an interesting, very interesting book. The problem is that this list of companies that Tom Peters and Bob Waterman studied didn't stay excellent companies. That is, many faltered. And so one of the things that comes obvious to people is that success is extremely temporary. My understanding is if you go back to the Fortune 500 in 1970, there's only a handful of them are still intact, that are still a standalone company that hasn't merged or been acquired by somebody else or changed their name or whatever. It's a small handful. And it only takes one incompetent executive to destroy any company. And many great companies get destroyed because an effective leader, a leader who went through all of what we're going to be going through in this video series and studied all these things and become great leaders, they walk off, and then they retire or whatever, and then their replacement winds up being incompetent and destroying the company. So what Tom Peters and Nancy Austin, now Nancy Austin works for Hewlett Packard, which was one of the companies that were studied in search of excellence, and they come to 2 conclusions. And that is that excellent companies that stay excellent, are those companies that wind up taking exceptional care of their customers. That is, they understand their customers better than their customers understand themselves. And so they are able to anticipate and to predict their customers are going to want in the future, design those future products, and make them and innovate. And so innovation becomes the key to the American economy. The American economy today only does 2 things, really. In essence, it innovates. So Apple or somebody in the Silicon Valley will create a new product. No customer ever asks for an innovation, but Apple creates these innovative products. But they're not manufactured in the United States. Those products will wind up being manufactured in Malaysia, sourced with products that come from Singapore, India, Vietnam. Then they are packaged, sent on a Swedish ship over to retailers that's owned by a Belgian company. So that's the way the United States works. And so then they wind up in a retail store in New York City where Americans go into debt, borrow the money to buy these innovative products. That's kind of the way the economy works. Well, that starts here in 1986. In 1986, it becomes incumbent on American industry to innovate. Innovation goes front and center. And in order to innovate, you have to understand your customers and listen to them and understand what they do. That starts here. Bob Waterman, who kind of got left out of this little 3-way thing here, he winds up publishing a book called The Renewal Factor in 1987. And he basically says, here are 8 things that excellent companies do to stay excellent. And so, and here again, this is kind of one of the things that is the opposite of what goes on in business schools. Stability in motion, the idea behind this is that you have a stable vision. This is where we're going. This is the ultimate goal. This is the aim of the company. This is what where we're headed. But inside of that kind of beach ball, if you will, is a whole swirling dynamics of innovation, change, things, making things happen. As long as the beach ball is going in the right direction, everything's fine. But inside the beach ball, a lot of freedom to do what you want to. So corporate culture, informed opportunity, the idea of allowing executives at the lower levels of the organization to make decisions, run their operations in a microscopic and sort of independent way with corporate direction is sort of what happens. Another thing that's key here with Bob Waterman stuff is the idea of running the company based on data. That is, prior to this time, data was mostly just about accounting, financial reporting. Most of that was being done simply because of government regulation requiring that those accounting things being done. And executives only looked at the most cursory and superficial financial information to run the company. By the time Bob Waterman gets through with corporate America, now everybody wants more and more and more and more and more data. So today, most executives are completely overwhelmed by data. Back in 1987, they had no data except sales and profit numbers. But today, they're just completely inundated. They know everything about, you can't buy anything anymore without getting a survey. You get the survey goes into a database, the database gets crunched, and then those numbers are given to the executives. So what you have here, because of Bob Waterman, is a penchant for American executives to want to run their company based on data. And then the last thing about Bob Waterman is corporate culture. Prior to this time, corporate culture was something nobody paid much attention to. And so we come to understand that everybody wants to work somewhere where it stands for something. You have to have a belief system, a value system, a sense of belonging, that you're doing something more than just getting out of bed in the morning and going somewhere where you make profit for shareholders who are all a lot more wealthy than you. And so the whole idea of having a corporate culture and everybody wanting to belong to an organization kind of gets started here with Bob Waterman. And so the better the culture you have, the more likely you are to innovate, the more likely you are to take better care of your customers, the more likely you are to have less turnover, et cetera, that causes organizations to kind of become successful. Then Dr. W. Edwards Deming shows up on the scene. Now, in 1980, NBC did a white paper report called "If Japan Can Do It, Why Can't We?" And basically, this report was about what was going on in Japan that was not going on in the United States. It was allowing these companies to destroy entire industries in the United States. And so everywhere they went in Japan to interview executives, they all heard Dr. Deming, Dr. Deming, Dr. Deming. And my experience has been that in Japan, whenever you say Dr. Deming, people bow. Even today, he was considered to be almost a godlike form. And so people are like, well, who is this guy? And it turns out that he lived here in the United States. He taught at NYU, later at Columbia, and then lived in Washington, D.C. And so people wonder, well, what's the story on this guy? Because basically he was almost unheard of in the United States at that point. And so you go back in history in 1950, he was there to do a statistical survey of the population of Japan. The United States basically owned Japan after the war. And so the United States was trying to build the country back up. But in 1950, we were doing a census in the United States, and nobody really had any idea what was going on, how many people were alive in Japan at the time. And so Deming, who had been trained in a lot in statistics, he actually had a PhD in the 1920s, 1926, I believe, from Yale University in what became called quantum mechanics later on. It was kind of statistics and physics combined. And so Deming knew a lot about statistical process control, having worked at the Hawthorne plant at Bell Labs in Chicago. And so he was invited to give an address to the Japanese Union of Scientists and Engineers in 1950. And to say that he changed the trajectory of the world is sort of an understatement. The Japanese embraced Deming and embraced his philosophies. Why? Well, the Japanese had never lost a war prior to World War II, and the Japanese believed that they had been ordained by God to be invincible. And here comes the United States and destroys them. And so they felt like, well, maybe God, kind of siding with these guys, so maybe we ought to listen to what these guys had to say. Well, it turns out that one of the top reasons that the United States won the war in World War II is simply because we could manufacture B-25 bombers faster than they could shoot them down. And the reason for that is that Deming, Juran, Schuhart, Walter Saracen, there's a whole cast of characters here that go to work in the defense industry to guide American industry to become more efficient. And in the process of that, they start manufacturing B-25 bombers at an unbelievably fast rate, simply because they take out all the waste, all the inefficiencies, and the United States is able to win the war. So in 1982, Deming, because of this fame he suddenly gets in 1980, writes a book called Out of the Crisis. And this book, kind of changes the world too. It kind of gets in that whole mix there with Tom Peters and Bob Waterman. And in that book, he discusses his 14 points and the 7 deadly diseases. In this series of videos, I have no intention of covering those 2 things. There's many people who have already done that. There's no reason for me to do that. I urge you, if you're not familiar with his 14 points and his 7 deadly diseases, to explore those. There's plenty of videos on the web, YouTube and such, that explain what that was all about. And if worse comes to worse, you can actually read Out of the Crisis. It was I think, revised in 1986, but the original version was in 1982. And so executives become frustrated by these broad generalizations. And a lot of it comes off as dogma. And the way it was delivered was a lot like dogma. And so a lot of executives who are desperate, I mean, they're sitting there watching their companies being destroyed, their industries being destroyed, they become desperate. And so they buy into the dogma. And here again, remember simplicity, complexity, simplicity. Okay, well, they bought into the simple version of it. Well, I can give you several examples. Like, for example, empowerment. So people should be empowered, so that kind of becomes the mantra somewhere around the early 1990s. Everybody should empower their workers. But what happens is they wind up empowering people, and some guy in the basement of some bank in Hong Kong, is empowered, to make trades based upon speculative derivatives, and he winds up destroying the whole bank. So, oh yeah, he was empowered, but he destroys the bank. And so executives are they're not big on risk. And so they start looking at these executives that wind up having their career destroyed because they buy into dogma. And so this blind faith leads to almost disillusionment. So more concrete results are desired, more concrete structures, more concrete list of actions that they should take becomes desired. And plus they want ROI, documentable results. Here again, being driven by results. And so they go back in and say, well, can I show that because I did A, B, and C, that led to higher results? It wasn't just dogma and feel good stuff. Okay, so this leads us to complexity. You see, the problem with complexity is the world is an extremely complex place. And so you have to get your head wrapped around the complexity. Nature doesn't organize complexity, you organize complexity. And so your interpretation of this complexity is what puts meaning into reality. And so it turns out that prejudice is natural. That is, you are predisposed to use a set of algorithms or a set of meaning, ways of looking at the world that guide the way that you look at the world. And so this interpretation, it becomes very, very, very important in the overall scheme of this. And so the word paradigm surfaces in all of this. I don't like the word paradigm, but that's just the word that we're kind of stuck with. And so these paradigms become important because they are predispositions of the way that you interpret the world. The way you kind of look at it is like a lens that goes over your eye. And so everything you see gets filtered through this lens. And so your reaction to reality is a function of this paradigm, and these paradigms wind up determining whether you're going to be successful or not. And so if you have the wrong interpretation of reality, you fail. If you have the right interpretation of reality, then you wind up being successful. So we spend a lot of time on this kind of stuff, this reaction to reality. And so we recognize the bias that comes in from these incoming stimuli. So one of the things that Dr. Deming was keen on was this idea of how you look at the world. And so if you look at the world through these eyes of these paradigms, or the German word Weltanschauung, Weltanschauung means your worldview. I think that's actually a better word than paradigm. But and so there's a whole host of these kinds of paradigms that are available to you. That is, you could decide which one you want to use. And so if you're a Marxist, then you kind of can look at the world through a Marxist lens. Then everything in your life looks like a struggle between the proletariat, and the aristocrats. If you're a Marxist, if you're let's say a socialist or a Keynesian economist, you kind of look at the world through this lens of the government can step in, the government can fix any problem. So there are a lot of these kinds of, thousands of these kinds of lenses that are available to you, and your choice of these lenses becomes controllable by you. And so one of the things that Deming was keen on during this whole episode was, how do you organize complexity, and what kind of lens do you have that you have put over your eye? So in particular, let's talk about in industry. If you have been led to believe that all your employees are idiots, are incapable of doing anything without some kind of immediate supervision, they're incapable of giving you any kind of feedback that might be actionable and useful in making your company better, okay, well then you don't go down to the assembly line. You stay in your office, just like Bob Waterman and Tom Peters said. You stay in your office, you don't go down the assembly line, you don't talk to your employees. Why? Because your employees are just a pack of idiots that don't know what they're doing. So if you have that lens, you're doomed to failure. Because it turns out that the employees know everything that's wrong with the company. Turns out the employees almost all know how to fix the problems that are associated with the company. And if you listen to them, you save yourself a lot of money. I can tell you one thing, as a consultant, one of the things that I used to do was I would go down when I was given the problem, I'd go down and talk to the workers. You put a bunch of jargon with it, put it into a 3-ring binder and stick an invoice in the front of it and give it back to the executives. If they're not willing to go talk to their employees, well, I was, and I was certainly willing to bill them for it. And, I made a small fortune, doing that. And why were they that way? It was their paradigm. They'd gone to business schools. Business schools told them that they were God and how important they were, and they were so smart, and they needed to surround themselves with people that reported to them, and increase their breadth of people that they reached in the organization, because that made them more powerful, and then that allowed them to make more money, and yak, and then their companies go into the tank, simply because they're not listening to the people that have the answers to the questions. So I can't overemphasize to you the importance of your worldview and how that goes through things. One of the things that I want to accomplish as we go through this series of videos is to change your worldview. I want you to think about the world in a very, very different way than you have thought about the world before. So raw complexity is just a menagerie of conflicting and inconsistent and whatever information. There's a wealth of things that you can look at. There's a plethora of data that you can look at, or ways of looking at the problem. Okay, so there are kind of 2 or 3 really kind of general ways of looking at complexity. One way you can look at complexity is to look at dynamics with just raw dynamics. So here, here's an example that I've given you in one of the overheads, where you kind of look at a company. It's where you have incoming supplies, and then it goes through all this kind of stuff, and then out at the end, the consumer winds up getting what they want. So the problem with this is that causation is very seldom simple. That is, that those arrows that I have in there, has been a straight arrow, are seldom ever straight. And then you get into these laws of unintended consequences and feedback loops. Essentially what happens, we'll talk much more about this when we get to systems theory, is that you squeeze on the balloon, it just pushes the air somewhere else. So yeah, you fix the problem over here, but the problem just surfaces somewhere else over here. Why? Because these arrows are not straight. These arrows are full of feedback loops. The cause and effect are separated tremendously in time and space. You have these open system problems, which we'll talk much more about, where even though you may think you control the company with these arrows, the truth of the matter is that you got competitors out there, you got the environment, you got the government, all these people that are impacting your company. So even though you think you have control over the companies, and these are nice little straight arrows that are going from one place to the other, you don't. And so this deludes you into having this false sense of security that you don't have. But that's one way of doing it, and that's the way a lot of people go about looking at the world. There's another way to do this, which is to put structure around all these dynamics. And so you create departments. So instead of having incoming supplies, you have procurement. Instead of having consumers out there, you have the marketing department. And so everything becomes a box that goes to another box, where the authoritative control lies. And this is another way of looking at it. So if I'm an executive, I can say, well, we have a consumer problem. That must be the marketing people. So I go down to the marketing people. And so you wind up dealing with these people in isolation. These boundaries, though, almost always become obstacles to fixing the company. Remember, go back to Tom Peters, Bob Waterman, Nancy Austin. Go back we taught people in business schools, how to have structure, how to have boxes and org charts and stuff like that wind up being incredibly dysfunctional. Have you ever seen a consumer or a customer on an org chart? I've never seen one. So what's the customer got to do with the org chart? Turns out org charts are just nothing more than a great way to blame people, to toss excuses for why something didn't happen. And so these boundaries, you see, follow authority. The authority winds up becoming fiefdoms. These fiefdoms wind up becoming people's career path. One of the reasons that executives love org charts is simply because it's a pictorial representation of their entire career. I started down here, I went to there, I went to there, I went to there, and now I control all these people down below me. Whatever. I know executives love org charts. Most employees hate them. So these boundaries mask this whole idea of causation. So if the marketing department, tells manufacturing that they're doing something wrong, then it becomes a political battle rather than an opportunity for the company to improve what they do. And so you wind up with this idea that I need to maximize my box. So I'm not going to play nice in the sandbox because I want to maximize my sandbox. I don't want to help my fellow workers over here who I look at as competitors to maximize their sandbox. And so these boundaries become obstacles over time. So which one of these two things is better? We could spend an hour just going through other different types of these kinds of algorithms for organizing reality. And it depends on your individual preference. So some executives have a tremendous need for structure. Some executives have a tremendous need for cognition. That is, everything in their life is kind of an if-then statement, and they want to have that kind of if-then type of thing going on. And so some people need to understand causation. Some people want to understand the dynamics, where the variance is coming from, how to eliminate the variance, how to control the variance. And so it depends on kind of your individual preference or your paradigm. Okay, so you understand why paradigms are so important. Now, almost all scholars agree that putting boxes on stuff is trouble, but they also realize that putting boxes on stuff is real. I mean, you go into organizations, you can't live in a fantasy land where you suddenly get rid of all the silos and all the org charts and all that. That's not reality. If you do that, you're going to pay an incredibly high price. And so all the scholars agree on that. There's never an easy answer, and there's always trade-offs to how you go about doing this stuff. So leaders back in the 1980s for a minute. So these leaders go back. I got to find a structure. I want a structure. I'm going to look around, for a structure. And so what they do is they're trying to figure out how to manage complexity. And they go around and they start looking. These scholars and consultants, executives. There's executive panels. Organizations like the Conference Board and people like that take it on to try, let's figure out what works. I need to know what works. Tell me what I can do, that will actually make a difference. And so they start looking for generalizations. Let's find a company that works, kind of like in search of excellence. Let's find a company that works and see what they do. Let's try to develop that into a theory, and then let's take that theory and start to generalize from that theory, and then let's apply it to a specific context. Let's see where it works and where it doesn't work, and then let's kind of go back and revamp the theory and kind of see what worked and what didn't work, and then let's come to some kind of conclusion. This is kind of the process that went on, in particular back in the 1990s. So what the executives did at that point, we all went back into history to see, where did things kind of go wrong? When were things right, and when did things kind of go wrong? And so they went all the way back into the Middle Ages into where craftsmanship got started. And most of this is guilds and apprenticeship programs. You didn't go to school to learn accounting. What you did was you sat beside an accountant, and that accountant taught you how to be an accountant. And then you became an accountant, and then you taught somebody else how to be an accountant. And it was this way on assembly lines and everything else. In the United States, you had two key characters. Eli Whitney, who kind of invented the cotton gin. That was what he's mostly known for. But the most important thing he ever did was to invent uniform parts. That is, he could take and manufacture 10 guns, take those guns and tear them apart, and then use the parts from each one of the 10 guns and put together 10 different guns, and they would all work simply because the parts were all completely uniform. Then Henry Ford took that information and turned that into how to manufacture automobiles at an incredibly fast rate, which allowed for very cheap prices because it worked out that all the inefficiencies associated with hand craftsmanship and all that just run up the price. So then Walter Shewhart, who becomes a key character in all of this, he worked for Bell Labs. He worked at the Hawthorne plant in Chicago. And that was where scientific management really got started, with controlled experiments. If we change this, what happens to the output? If we change this, what happens to the output? And so Walter Shewhart comes up with something called PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, and Act. So PDCA becomes the cornerstone of continuous improvement. This was a major, major breakthrough in the world and a major breakthrough in industry. The problem that Walter Shewhart had was that telephones were becoming more and more and more and more common, and they had to manufacture them at a higher and higher rate, which led them to go get more and more and more suppliers. Those suppliers would manufacture the parts inside the tolerances that were given to them by Bell Labs or Bell Telephone. But then when they got to the plant, the combined variance between all the suppliers wouldn't let the phone work or wouldn't let the switchboard work. You see, so Walter Shewhart had to kind of get that under control. And so he became kind of the cornerstone of the theory of American manufacturing. Joe Duran and Ed Deming, two of the key people that wind up driving the quality movement, both worked for Walter Shewhart at the Hawthorne plant. And that becomes a key piece to all of what we're about to talk about. So the British military standards become another place. In World War II, the British, who did not have natural resources, were required to buy their parts from manufacturers located wherever they could find a manufacturing place, primarily the United States. And by the time they would get them all to England, they wouldn't fit. And so because of that, they had to come up with these what are called British mill standards. And these mill standards become another place, a cornerstone for quality. The United States embraces the British military standards because they work, because it allows to not having defects and stuff. So these structures emerge. And it's important for us just to take a real quick flyby so we can see where the system of profound knowledge fits into all this historically. ISO 9000 becomes a huge deal. It's designed by the Organization for International Standardization. It's located in Geneva. And its initials, its acronym would be OIS. But ISO is a Greek term meaning equal. And so they have an agenda. ISO's agenda is to create uniform parts, uniform processes, uniform whatever, worldwide. Now the reason for that is that will always drive down the cost. If I have a 9-volt battery, I can buy a 9-volt battery anywhere on the planet Earth. I can buy one in Vietnam, I can buy one in China, Hong Kong, Japan, Malaysia, South Africa. A 9-volt battery is a 9-volt battery is a 9-volt battery. They all fit. They're all exactly the same. As a result of that, the price goes way, way, way down. You might contrast this with cell phones that have replaceable batteries. Those are all very, very different. Those batteries cost, $50, $60. Sometimes they cost more than the stinking telephone. Whereas a 9-volt battery is, virtually free. I'm pretty sure you can get them one in a box of cereal. And so ISO has this agenda, and this agenda is to have uniform parts that are, no matter where they're manufactured, they fit. So there are ISO standards for screws, for bolts, for threads, for you name it, there was ISO standards for them. Now what happens is that in the 1990s, ISO becomes used as a trade barrier. That is, you cannot sell to any governmental organization in Europe if you are not ISO 9000 certified. And so the United States got caught flat-footed. Here we are grappling with how to kind of stay in business, and these guys put a quality standard on American companies that say, if you're not ISO 9001 certified, we won't buy your products. And so in the United States, there's a mad rush to try to figure out how to get American companies ISO certified. And so it becomes a huge, huge advantage, originally at least, for increasing American quality, because you had to have a registrar. The registrar had to audit you and examine you to make sure that what you say you're making is what you say you're making. But then what happens is that it kind of falls onto some semi-bad times. The criteria wound up being flawed. They had to rewrite the criteria to overcome some of these deficiencies. There was one story, I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a great story, which is a guy set up a concrete life jacket manufacturing facility and got ISO 9001 certified. Even though each one of them would have killed the person that put them on, they still were all manufactured exactly the same. And since they were manufactured exactly the same, then that would wind up being able to be certified. So now you drive down the highway, you see these trucking companies that have ISO 9001 certified on the back of their 18-wheeler. And so this is kind of became a common thing. The United States took over that process from ISO, the American Society for Quality. Originally it was the ASQC, American Society for Quality Control, takes over that process along with ANSI, the American National Standards Institute. And so it's easy to get ISO 9000 certified. But it was a great structure because executives could say, okay, here's some criteria, here's what I have to document, this is the way I can put it into a 3-ring binder, I can get my head wrapped around that. It wasn't just admonitions. The Deming Prize shows up after Deming's address in 1950. The Japanese Union of Scientists and Engineers decide to have something called the Deming Prize. And this is to award the company in Japan that has the highest level of quality. It's and to try to benchmark these best practices. And so the idea behind that is that one Japanese company does very well at one thing, they can pass that along to all the other Japanese companies, and so they can learn from each other. This is the Keiretsu, what's called Japan Incorporated. The top manufacturers were very, very influenced by Deming, and so they would take and benchmark the best quality practices in the country, share them among other organizations, even competitors, because the purpose at that point was to rebuild the Japanese economy more so than it was to be in competition with some other company. And so the JUSE is a highly professional organization. The JUSE is populated by engineers, quality control professionals who have spent a lifetime of understanding quality and all this. And so the assessing and judging process on the Deming Prize is intense, to say the least. You can't fake your way through it. The Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award was passed in the United States in 1987 to sort of mirror the Deming Prize, but it was going to be represented as being uniquely American. There were several efforts to get this through Congress. So instead of going to a private organization like JUSE, or going to the ASQ in the United States. Instead, they went to Congress. Now, I can't imagine a worse place to go to get something done, but that's where they went. They tried to get this passed, and it failed. And then there was a guy named Malcolm Baldrige, who was the head of the Department of Commerce, and he was Ronald Reagan's best friend, one of his best friends. And he got killed in a rodeo accident in Wyoming. And so they decided to name the bill the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award, and then who could not vote for that? So it made its way through Congress. And so in 1987, this gets started in the United States as a structure. Here again, a structure. I go to executives and I say, well, here are 7 categories that consist of 128 or whatever it is these days, questions that you have to answer. And so I can go to other organizations, go to training sessions, go to judges, go to consultants and whoever, who can help guide me through this structure. Okay? And so I give you on the overheads a kind of a graphical representation of the Baldrige Award. This is called the hamburger model because it kind of looks like a hamburger, but it basically shows the 7 categories, which are leadership, strategic planning, customer focus, and then data analysis, information systems, HR, and process management, and then results. Now they've changed the names over time. Today it's called customer. Instead of being called customer focus, it's now called customer engagement. But they change it from time to time. They're constantly updating the criteria. And so just to let you know what the Baldrige Award is about, and there are state awards that parallel this. So if you are located in Texas, like I am now, you can apply for the Texas Quality Award, which is a very prestigious, very rigorous program and a very useful program for you to be involved in. And the good news about it is it's virtually free. I mean, you have to pay an application fee and such, or if you go to a training session, you might have to pay a little bit of money to send your employees. But for all practical purposes, it's free, and you get guidance, and you get to sit down at a table with people who have been where you've been and learn from them. And so and how you integrate this architecture, how you integrate these 7 categories becomes key. And the focus there, of course, is on leadership, and then work processes that lead to outcomes, and then results that are measures of the progress going on. And then, of course, the ultimate outcome becomes your marketplace power and customer satisfaction. So I only tell you this, and although I would, encourage people, I've been a senior examiner and I'm a judge in the Florida Quality Award process. This is a very useful tool for executives simply because it forces people into a structure and it helps guide people up to a point. Now, it will only take you to a point. And I believe personally that Deming's system of profound knowledge will take you to a higher level place, because one of the things that Baldrige lacks is the ability to tell you how to do what it's asking you to do. Okay? And so the scoring, I give you the scoring, is a combination of approach. You have an advanced approach, or you have a naive approach. And then you have deployment, how deeply embedded is it in the organization. And then you have the results category, as basically, can you show that these results are benchmarked against world-class performance? How are you doing relative to your competitors? How do you do relative to people in your marketplace, et cetera, et cetera. So I've given you a couple of slides here that compare Deming Prize and Baldrige, just so that you can have it. And there is and just to summarize it, and the Deming Prize is much, much, much more statistical process control and manufacturing-ish related, operations related than Baldrige is. It has in Deming Prize, you have a 1,000-page application, and a consultant, a JUSE approved person has to work in the company alongside you for a year. I mean, it's much more rigorous than in the Baldrige Award, which has volunteers who come in and become examiners and judges. I'm not demeaning Baldrige because it is extremely rigorous. Very, very, very few companies can master what Baldrige is all about. But the Deming Prize is at a level clearly one step above that. So different regions of the country do the same thing. So I've given you pictures of the Australian one, the European one, the Japanese one, the India one, the Iberian Peninsula one, the Singapore one. So these models proliferate around the world. Everybody buys into them simply because they lead to higher performance, greater efficiency, greater customer satisfaction, less turnover. It works. Executives like it because it's straightforward, has a structure to it, gives them a number that they can use, and it just plain works. And so these things proliferate. Deming found them all this highly offensive. He doesn't buy into the structure of Baldrige. He says it's too simplistic. You have these laughable winners. I mean, like for example, Cadillac became one of the winners of the Baldrige Award, and it was laughable. I mean, a Coupe de Ville, was a Baldrige Award winner. I don't believe at the time that Cadillac had ever been in the top 10 J.D. Powers. And anyway, it was laughable. And you see this advertising, where the Cadillac Coupe de Ville would be advertised winner of the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. It just made it laughable. As a matter of fact, it's almost hard to understand how Baldrige survived that. And then you had a couple of winners that declared bankruptcy. That didn't help anything. Deming was opposed to. He stays silent on the structure of the Deming Prize, primarily because of the rigor and the science associated with the JUSE. But he is not a big fan of the Baldrige Award, and so and he really doesn't like this superficial glorification of the executives. So one of the things that happens is executives are driven to win the award, not driven to win the award because it improves their organization. They're driven to win the award. I mean, it's a big deal. You have the President of the United States comes down and congratulates everybody and all this. I mean, it's a huge deal. It's a major plus on your resume to have been associated with a Baldrige winner. And so Deming doesn't like that part of it. I've been a senior examiner. I'm a judge of the Florida Quality Award. I mean, so it's not like I don't recognize the value of it. It's just that at the highest level, which is where Deming is kind of headed, it has some pitfalls. At lower levels, it's certainly a valuable tool, like ISO 9000 would be, or whatever. And so Deming's view of this is that every problem is a leadership problem, not a leader problem, but a leadership problem. There's no such thing as instant pudding. Everybody wants a simple answer to the simple questions. Remember, simplicity, complexity, simplicity. Everybody wants to get that answer that doesn't require any work, any reading, any study, any examination, no analysis, et cetera, et cetera. That's what everybody wants. And of course that's what everybody wants. I mean, everybody wants to hire a consultant. I've done it a big piece of my life. They hire a consultant like me who understands this stuff. I give them the answer. Hallelujah. Oh, what a great deal. They cut me a check, I give them the answer, and then they go implement it and everything's fine. The next time they have a problem, they hire somebody like me or hire me again, come in, fix that problem. That happened just last week to me. People call, they say, well, what's the answer to this problem? You give them the answer. But they never master this because they can't control their own destiny because they never went through the hard work. And so in Deming's mind, the success of an organization is being driven in very large part by its leadership capacity in every system in the organization. So you can't just develop the leadership capacity at the top. It's got to be throughout the organization. Anywhere you find a problem, the cause of that problem is going to be in the leadership of one rung above it. If you got a manufacturing problem, look for the problem to be whoever's in charge of manufacturing. It's whoever's controlling that part of the system. And then if there's an interaction between different parts of the organization that are causing trouble, go up a notch or two above those. You'll find that's where the problem is. And so he understood that. So Deming's philosophy is extremely rigorous on leadership, but at the same time, extremely human. He was an incredibly righteous human being. He was devoutly religious. he saw the suffering of the Japanese in 1950, and he believed that human suffering was done in very large part the result of poor leadership. And so he thought if he could develop leadership capacity, then he could end a lot of the human suffering. So this is his general sort of the general model that we're going to use, the figure we're going to use to drive our way through this. Deming believed that there were four major components that an executive had to understand in depth, and the interaction of these four components. So what we're going to do in this video series is we're going to take each one of the components one at a time, and we're going to dive into them in some depth. We're going to give you some depth and going to give you a lot of resources that you can go to increase the amount of knowledge that you have about these four components. And then we're going to come back and we're going to deal with the interactions, 2 at a time, 3 at a time, and then finally 4 at a time, or what he called metanoia. Metanoia was a term used by the ancient Christian church to refer to as sort of like what we call atonement today. That is where you see how everything fits together all at one time. It's sort of a euphoric experience. You understand how people affect systems, systems affect variation, variation is affected by knowledge, systems are designed based on knowledge. You know, the kind of knowledge that employees have affects the amount of variation you have, the variation affects the kind of systems you have. You have to understand the interaction of all four of the components all at one time. And that's what we're going to deal with head on here. In the next module, we'll start with systems theory.